They called it an island of volcanic ash and fire, but for 36 days it became the closest thing to hell on Earth. Iwo Jima, a small speck of land in the vast Pacific Ocean, 8 square miles of black volcanic sand, and yet it would become one of the bloodiest battlefields of World War II. For the men who fought there, it wasn't about victory or glory. It was about survival. If you believe these stories of courage and sacrifice should never be forgotten, subscribe to War Stories History and help us keep their memory alive. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific was reaching its brutal climax. The United States had captured island after island, Saipan, Guam, the Philippines, each one bringing them closer to Japan itself. But there was one island standing in their path, Iwo Jima. It was more than just rock and sand. It was a fortress, a shield protecting Japan's homeland. From its 2 airfields, Japanese fighters intercepted American bombers headed for Tokyo. And for the U.S. military, that was unacceptable. To launch the final assault on Japan, they needed Iwo Jima. But taking it would cost everything. The Japanese defenders, nearly 21,000 strong, were commanded by General Kuribayashi. He knew he could not win, but he was determined to make the Americans pay dearly for every inch of ground. Kuribayashi transformed the island into an underground fortress. Tunnels, bunkers, hidden artillery positions, a maze of death stretching for miles beneath the surface. Unlike other battles, there would be no frontal banzai charges, no suicidal attacks. Instead, the Japanese would fight from the shadows, invisible, silent, and waiting. On February 19, 1945, the invasion began. Before dawn, American battleships opened fire, pounding the island with thousands of shells. The sky turned black with smoke. The ground shook like thunder. For 3 days, the bombardment continued. Commanders believed nothing could have survived. They were wrong. At 9 a.m., the first wave of U.S. Marines hit the beach. 70,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions. They expected resistance, but what they faced was something far worse. As their landing craft touched the shore, they stepped onto the black volcanic sand, soft, hot, and deep. It was impossible to dig in. Bullets found them instantly. Then, silence. For a brief moment, the beach was eerily quiet. Marines began to move forward, thinking the bombardment had wiped out the defenders, and then the ground erupted. From the slopes of Mount Suribachi, from the cliffs, from the hidden tunnels, thousands of Japanese guns opened fire all at once. Mortars, machine guns, artillery. It was a storm of steel. Marines fell by the dozens. Landing craft were blown apart. Tanks sank into the soft sand, unable to move. There was nowhere to hide. No trees, no cover, just open black sand and death raining from above. One Marine later said, "The first 5 minutes on the beach were the longest 5 minutes of my life." Another remembered looking around and realizing every single man in his landing craft was either dead or wounded. And the air was filled with screams, explosions, and the acrid smell of burning fuel. The wounded called for medics who never came, because they too were already dead. But the Marines did not stop. They kept moving, crawling, dragging their wounded, inch by inch. Every step forward was a battle. Every mound of sand was soaked with blood. By the end of the first day, they had gained just 700 yards inland, and more than 2,000 Marines were already dead or wounded. Yet still, they held the beach. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun. That night, as the surviving Marines huddled in shallow pits, the sky glowed red from the burning island. The sound of machine guns never stopped, and somewhere beneath their feet, Japanese soldiers moved silently through tunnels, waiting for the next attack. On Iwo Jima there was no front line. There was no safety. Death came from everywhere and nowhere. The island that was supposed to fall in a few days would instead take more than a month of relentless fighting. And for both sides, the real hell was only just beginning. When the sun rose over Iwo Jima on the second day, the beaches were littered with wrecked tanks, smoking landing craft, and the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with gunpowder, and the smell of death hung heavy over the black sand. For the Marines who had survived the first day, there was only one order: move forward. But on Iwo Jima, forward meant stepping into the unknown. As the troops advanced inland, they quickly realized this was no ordinary battlefield. The enemy wasn't waiting in front of them. They were beneath them, hidden in an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers. The Japanese defenders could appear anywhere, fire, vanish, and reappear from another hole hundreds of feet away. It was like fighting ghosts. Every hill, every pile of rocks, every shadow could be death waiting to strike. General Kuribayashi's plan was working perfectly. His soldiers rarely exposed themselves to direct fire. Instead, they fought from underground chambers, using hidden artillery to rain destruction on the Marines from unseen positions. American flamethrowers and demolition teams tried to clear the tunnels, but every time they destroyed one, another would open up behind them. It was a fortress of death built inside the earth itself. By the third day, Mount Suribachi, the island's volcanic peak, stood like a dark sentinel over the battlefield. From its slopes, Japanese gunners had a perfect view of the beach. Every movement below was targeted with precision. For the Marines, taking Suribachi became the first objective. Without it, the rest of the island would be impossible to hold. But climbing that mountain meant charging directly into fortified caves and machine gun nests. As one Marine later said, "You didn't see the enemy. You just saw muzzle flashes." And every flash meant another man gone. The U.S. Navy unleashed another round of bombardment, turning the mountain into a storm of fire and smoke. But even that wasn't enough. The Japanese were dug too deep. Every foot of progress came at a terrible cost. Squads advanced only a few yards before being pinned down. Flamethrowers roared as Marines tried to flush the defenders out. The heat melted the sand into glass. Yet for every bunker destroyed, the Japanese fought on with an unbreakable will. They had no plans to retreat, no thoughts of surrender. Their mission was simple: kill as many Americans as possible before they died. Amid this chaos, acts of incredible courage became routine. Medics crawled through open fire to reach the wounded. Machine gunners refused to back down even when outnumbered. Men carried their brothers on their backs through the volcanic ash, knowing they might not make it back themselves. It wasn't about orders anymore. It was about honor, duty, and survival. By February 22nd, after 4 days of brutal combat, Marines had surrounded Mount Suribachi. The Japanese defenders refused to surrender, fighting from caves until the very last bullet. The Marines advanced cautiously, blasting every tunnel and bunker they could find. The entire mountain seemed alive with fire and smoke. And then, on February 23, 1945, a small group of Marines reached the summit. There, under the gray morning sky, they raised an American flag. At that moment, the men below on the beaches cheered. Ships offshore blew their horns. For the first time since the invasion began, the Marines felt a glimmer of hope. But the battle was far from over. The flag on Suribachi was a symbol of courage, but beyond the mountain lay the rest of the island, where tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were still waiting, ready to fight to the death. What lay ahead would be even more horrifying: a grind of blood, fire, and sacrifice that would test every man's soul. The Marines had taken the mountain, but the island itself was still a nightmare of tunnels, traps, and death. "We thought the worst was behind us," one Marine said later, but Iwo Jima had just begun to show us its true face. The Battle of Iwo Jima was not a fight for ground. It was a fight for endurance, for brotherhood, and for survival against an enemy that refused to die. The American flag now flew over Mount Suribachi, a small patch of color in a world of gray smoke and death. But for the Marines still fighting below, there was no celebration, only the sound of gunfire echoing across the island. Because for them, the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. Even as the flag waved in the wind, Japanese shells continued to fall. For every Marine who took a step forward, another fell beside him. Mount Suribachi was only the beginning. The rest of the island, the northern plateau, was still a labyrinth of death, and that's where General Kuribayashi had positioned his strongest defenses. The Marines soon discovered that every inch of Iwo Jima had to be fought for, taken and secured, sometimes at the cost of dozens of lives. Each day, the battle turned into a nightmare of smoke, blood, and chaos. Japanese artillery and mortars rained destruction from hidden positions. Even when a bunker was captured, the enemy would reappear behind the Marines through unseen tunnels. You never knew where the next shot would come from. The ground itself seemed alive, breathing fire and death. The heat was unbearable. The black volcanic sand absorbed the sun like a furnace. Every movement was exhausting, every breath heavy with sulfur and smoke. There was no shade, no escape, no silence. Bodies of fallen soldiers, both American and Japanese, lay scattered across the battlefield. There was no time to bury them. The living simply stepped over the dead and kept moving. It was a place where time lost meaning, where courage became routine, and survival felt like a miracle. On February 23, 1945, while the first flag still waved proudly on Suribachi, another flag was raised, the one captured in the iconic photograph that would forever define the American spirit. 6 Marines, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, Michael Strank, René Gagnon, Ira Hayes, and Harold Schultz, hoisted the stars and stripes atop the mountain. Joe Rosenthal's photograph froze that moment in history, a moment of unity, of triumph, of hope in the middle of hell. But what most people never knew was that 3 of those men would never leave Iwo Jima alive. As the flag soared above, the fight on the ground grew even more vicious. The Marines pushed north toward the airfields, where Kuribayashi's men fought to the last breath. Every bunker had to be cleared by hand. Flamethrowers roared, grenades exploded, rifles cracked in the endless rhythm of death. The air smelled of smoke and burnt flesh, and the cries of wounded men carried over the battlefield like haunting whispers. One Marine later said, "You could feel the island breathing. It was alive. Alive with the enemy, buried underneath us, waiting to kill." The Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Even when surrounded, they fought to the death. If captured, they sometimes pulled the pin on their own grenades, choosing death over dishonor. For the Marines, it was a war without mercy. They couldn't take chances. Every shadow might hide a trap. Every cave might be a tomb. After weeks of relentless combat, the Marines had captured both airfields, but the Japanese still held strong positions in the north. Kuribayashi's men refused to break. Even when cut off from food, water, and ammunition, they fought on. For every yard of ground gained, hundreds died. By early March, the battlefield was nothing but ruins. Entire divisions had been shattered. Medical stations overflowed with the wounded, and still the orders came. Keep moving forward. No one slept. No one smiled. Only the constant sound of artillery and the silent question in every Marine's mind. Was it worth it? For the Japanese, there was no retreat, no surrender. Each soldier had sworn to die for his emperor, and General Kuribayashi, their commander, refused to give up, even as his men were dying around him. In a final letter to Tokyo, he wrote, "The battle is drawing near its end. My men are still fighting with honor. I will not be captured." He knew what awaited him, and yet he chose to stay. By mid-March, the island that had once been alive with gunfire was now nothing but ash, silence, and ghosts. The Americans had taken Iwo Jima, but victory came at a price beyond imagination. "For every step forward," one Marine whispered, "we left a brother behind." And as the smoke cleared, the survivors looked around at the destruction and realized the island they had fought so hard to capture wasn't worth the lives it had taken, but they had done their duty. They had given everything, and soon the world would know the true cost of Iwo Jima. The island of Iwo Jima was dying. What had once been 8 square miles of black volcanic rock was now a wasteland, scorched, shattered, and soaked in blood. The sky above was gray, choked with smoke. The earth trembled beneath the roar of artillery, and beneath it all, deep in the tunnels, the last defenders of Japan waited, ready to die. By mid-March 1945, the Marines had taken both airfields. They had fought across the island inch by inch, burning, blasting, and crawling through fire. They had lost friends, leaders, and brothers. But still, they moved forward. The American flag flew high over Suribachi, a silent witness to the cost of victory. The Japanese soldiers who remained were no longer an army. They were ghosts, starving, wounded, and surrounded, yet they refused to surrender. General Kuribayashi, the man who had turned Iwo Jima into an underground fortress, knew the end was near. His troops were out of ammunition. His communications were cut off. But his spirit, and that of his men, remained unbroken. In his final message, he wrote, "We will continue to resist until the last man falls. May Japan never forget our sacrifice." And then, on a quiet night in late March, Kuribayashi led his remaining men in one last charge, a desperate, hopeless assault against overwhelming odds. Armed with bayonets, swords, and grenades, they rushed into the darkness. It was a suicidal attack, the final act of defiance from men who refused to be defeated. By dawn, nearly all of them were dead. Kuribayashi's body was never found. Some say he took his own life rather than be captured. Others believe he fell in battle, leading his men to the very end. When the gunfire finally stopped, the island was silent for the first time in 36 days. The Battle of Iwo Jima was over. But what remained was devastation. More than 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island, almost every man who had set foot on it. It was victory, but victory at a price few could comprehend. In the days that followed, American forces turned Iwo Jima into a critical base for operations against Japan. From its runways, damaged bombers returning from raids over Tokyo could now land safely. Thousands of airmen would survive because of it. But for the Marines who had fought there, the cost of that small island would haunt them forever. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt was told the battle was finally over, he bowed his head in silence. Even victory, he knew, had lost its meaning. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later say, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue." Those words became immortal, because on that island, in the smoke, the fire, the screams, ordinary men had done the impossible. They had faced hell itself, and won. Yet even in victory, the flag that waved above Iwo Jima carried more than pride. It carried pain, loss, and sacrifice. Out of the 6 Marines who raised that flag, 3 would die on the island before the battle ended. Their names, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, and Michael Strank, became forever etched in history. They didn't raise that flag for glory. They raised it for every man who wouldn't return home. When survivors finally left Iwo Jima, they didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They simply looked back at the island, black, broken, silent, and whispered quiet prayers for the dead. The 36 days of hell were finally over. But for those who lived through it, the memories would never fade. "If I die," one Marine had written to his family before the invasion, "just tell them I gave my life for something greater than myself." And he did. They all did. Iwo Jima became a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, and of the unbreakable spirit of those who fought for something bigger than life itself. The island was small. The cost was immense, but the legacy will never die. This was the Battle of Iwo Jima, the 36 days of hell, a story of fire, faith, and the men who refused to fall. If you believe their sacrifice should never be forgotten, subscribe to War Stories History and join us as we continue to honor the heroes who shaped our world.